In a bustling grocery store on a chilly autumn morning, Sarah noticed an elderly woman struggling to reach a can of soup on the top shelf. Without hesitation, she walked over and offered her assistance. It was a simple gesture, one that would have gone unnoticed by most people rushing through their daily routines. But this ordinary moment would spark an extraordinary chain of events that neither woman could have predicted. Sarah, a 32-year-old nurse working double shifts at the local hospital, had always believed in treating others with kindness, just as her grandmother had taught her. The elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, was visibly grateful for the help. Her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped her shopping cart, and Sarah noticed she seemed a bit disoriented. Instead of simply walking away after helping with the can, Sarah felt compelled to ask if Mrs. Thompson needed help with the rest of her shopping. What started as a chance encounter turned into an hour-long shopping trip, with Sarah patiently helping Mrs. Thompson navigate the aisles, reading labels, and sharing stories about their lives. Mrs. Thompson spoke about her late husband, their adventures traveling across the country, and how lonely life had become since his passing 3 years ago. Sarah listened intently, sharing bits of her own life, her struggles as a single mother raising 2 young children while pursuing her nursing career. As they reached the checkout counter, Sarah noticed Mrs. Thompson fumbling with her wallet, her arthritis-riddled fingers struggling with the zipper. Without drawing attention to it, Sarah quietly helped her count out the correct change, making sure to preserve the older woman's dignity. The cashier watched the interaction with a warm smile, later telling her coworker it was refreshing to see such genuine kindness in today's fast-paced world. But the story doesn't end at the grocery store. Mrs. Thompson insisted on getting Sarah's contact information, saying she'd love to have her over for tea sometime. Sarah agreed, thinking it would be nice to check in on the sweet lady occasionally. She helped load the groceries into Mrs. Thompson's car and made sure she was safely seated before saying goodbye. Little did Sarah know that Mrs. Thompson wasn't just an ordinary elderly woman living alone. Behind her humble demeanor lay a lifetime of success, influence, and a deep desire to make a difference in someone's life before her time came to an end. The simple act of kindness Sarah showed that day would set in motion a series of events that would not only change her life, but also impact her children's future in ways she could never imagine. The following week, when Sarah received a call from Mrs. Thompson's lawyer, she assumed something terrible had happened to the kind elderly lady. Her heart raced as she dialed the number, worried about the woman who had touched her heart with her gentle spirit and wonderful stories. The lawyer's voice was warm but professional as he began to explain the reason for his call. "Mrs. Thompson asked me to contact you regarding a matter of great importance," he said, pausing briefly. "She was deeply moved by your kindness that day at the grocery store, and she wants to." And that's where our story takes an unexpected turn. A turn that would prove that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the biggest surprises, and that genuine compassion still has the power to transform lives in our modern world. Stay tuned to discover how this chance encounter between two strangers from different walks of life unfolds into something truly remarkable. The lawyer's voice continued through the phone. "She wants to establish a substantial scholarship fund in your name at the local nursing school." Sarah's hand trembled as she held the phone, struggling to process what she was hearing. But that wasn't all. Mrs. Thompson had specifically requested to meet with Sarah again, this time at her home, to discuss something even more important. 2 days later, Sarah found herself driving up a long, winding driveway to a beautiful colonial-style house tucked away in the city's historic district. The house wasn't overly luxurious, but it held an air of quiet dignity, much like its owner. As Sarah parked her car, she noticed the meticulously maintained garden, filled with roses of every color, a hobby Mrs. Thompson had mentioned during their grocery store conversation. Mrs. Thompson greeted her at the door with the same warm smile Sarah remembered, though this time she seemed more energetic, more purposeful. Over tea served in delicate china cups that Mrs. Thompson mentioned were wedding gifts from 1962, she began to share her story. She hadn't always been alone or elderly. In her younger years, she and her husband had built one of the largest private healthcare companies in the state, operating several hospitals and medical centers. But success means nothing without purpose, Mrs. Thompson said, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "When you helped me that day, you didn't know who I was. You didn't help me because of what I might be able to do for you. You helped me because it was the right thing to do." Her eyes welled up with tears as she continued, "That's exactly the kind of person we need more of in healthcare." Sarah listened, still confused about why she was really there. The scholarship fund was already more than she could comprehend. A chance for others like her to pursue their nursing dreams without the crushing weight of student debt she carried. But Mrs. Thompson's expression suggested there was more to come. Opening an elegant wooden box on the coffee table, Mrs. Thompson pulled out a stack of photographs. They showed a younger version of herself and her husband standing in front of various hospitals and medical centers. "We built all of this from nothing," she explained, "but now I'm the last one left. No children, no family to carry on what we started." Sarah's heart raced as Mrs. Thompson reached for another document folder. The elderly woman's hands were steady now, her voice clear and determined. "I've been watching you since that day at the store," she admitted. "I had my lawyer do some research. I know about your volunteer work at the community clinic. I know how you help your elderly neighbors with their medical appointments. I know about the support group you started for single parents in healthcare." The room fell silent for a moment as Mrs. Thompson gathered her thoughts. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, and the scent of roses drifted in from the garden. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she waited for what would come next. "I'm not just looking for someone to give money to," Mrs. Thompson said, opening the document folder. "I'm looking for someone to entrust with a legacy." She paused, her eyes meeting Sarah's with an intensity that made everything else in the room seem to fade away. "And I believe I've found that person." As Mrs. Thompson began to explain her proposal, Sarah realized that her simple act of kindness in the grocery store was about to turn into something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. But with this opportunity would come choices, difficult choices that would test her values, her courage, and her determination in ways she never expected. Mrs. Thompson's proposal was both incredible and overwhelming. She wanted to transfer majority ownership of her healthcare company to Sarah, along with the responsibility of maintaining its charitable programs that helped thousands of underprivileged patients each year. The company, valued at over $50 million, wasn't just a business. It was a lifeline for countless families who couldn't afford proper medical care. Sarah's mind raced with questions and doubts. How could she, a single mother working double shifts, possibly run a healthcare empire? The weight of such responsibility felt crushing. Mrs. Thompson seemed to read her thoughts, reaching across to pat Sarah's trembling hands. "My dear, I've seen how you handle responsibility. You manage to raise 2 children alone, work full-time, and still find time to help others. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need." But the decision wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. The board of directors, mostly old friends of Mrs. Thompson's late husband, were skeptical about handing over control to an outsider. Some had their own candidates in mind, primarily their children or business associates who'd been eyeing the company for years. Sarah would need to prove herself worthy not just to Mrs. Thompson, but to a room full of experienced executives who'd been in the business longer than she'd been alive. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself juggling her regular nursing shifts with crash courses in business management. Mrs. Thompson arranged for her to shadow various department heads, learning the intricacies of running a healthcare organization. During lunch breaks, she'd study financial reports and company policies, determined to understand every aspect of the business. The pressure mounted when word got out about Mrs. Thompson's intentions. Anonymous letters began arriving at the hospital where Sarah worked, suggesting she was manipulating an elderly woman for financial gain. Some of her colleagues, once friendly, now regarded her with suspicion and barely concealed jealousy. Sarah's children noticed their mother's stress, asking why she came home later each night with worried lines creasing her forehead. Then came the pivotal board meeting. Sarah stood outside the imposing conference room, her heart pounding as she heard heated discussions through the heavy wooden doors. Mrs. Thompson had insisted she attend, but now, dressed in her newly bought business suit that felt foreign compared to her familiar scrubs, Sarah wondered if she was in over her head. Just before entering, she received an urgent call from her son's school. He had fallen during recess and needed to be picked up immediately. At the same moment, her phone buzzed with messages about a crucial vote about to take place in the boardroom. Sarah froze in the hallway, torn between her responsibilities as a mother and the opportunity of a lifetime. The boardroom doors opened, and Mrs. Thompson's lawyer gestured for her to come in. The room fell silent as she entered, facing a table full of stern faces and questioning looks. Mrs. Thompson sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable as Sarah took her seat, knowing the next few minutes would determine not just her future, but the future of thousands who depended on the company's charitable programs. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed again, another call from the school. The board members exchanged glances, some shaking their heads disapprovingly. Sarah looked at Mrs. Thompson, then at her phone, and in that moment, she knew she had to make a decision that would reveal everything about who she truly was and what she really valued. With all eyes in the boardroom fixed on her, Sarah stood up and addressed the room with quiet determination. "I need to leave right now to pick up my injured child from school," she announced. "If that makes me unsuitable for this position in your eyes, then so be it. But I won't compromise on being there for my children. That's the same commitment I'll bring to every patient and employee in this company." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Thompson began to laugh, a warm, genuine laugh that seemed to break the tension in the room. "That's exactly the answer I was hoping for," she said, standing up slowly. "You see, my dear board members, I arranged that call from the school. It was a test, one that Sarah passed brilliantly." The revelation sent murmurs through the boardroom. Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice growing stronger. "This company was built on putting people first, something some of you seem to have forgotten." She glanced pointedly at several board members who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "While you've been focused on profit margins, Sarah demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership we need." But just as the tide seemed to turn in Sarah's favor, the boardroom doors burst open, and walked Robert Hayes, Mrs. Thompson's estranged nephew, whom she hadn't seen in 15 years. "I hope I'm not too late for the party," he announced with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He slapped a thick folder of documents on the table. "Before any decisions are made, I think everyone should see these." The folder contained newspaper clippings and social media posts about a medical incident from Sarah's past, a case where she had gone against hospital protocol to save a homeless patient's life. While the patient survived, the incident had resulted in a formal reprimand in her file. Robert presented it as evidence of Sarah's disregard for rules and proper procedures. Mrs. Thompson's face paled as she read through the documents. The board members whispered among themselves, their earlier warming attitudes beginning to cool. Sarah felt her heart sink. She had never told Mrs. Thompson about this incident, not out of shame, but because it had happened years ago and she'd never thought it relevant. But then something unexpected happened. One of the oldest board members, Dr. Richards, who hadn't spoken a word throughout the meeting, suddenly cleared his throat. "I remember this case," he said, his voice gravelly with age. "I was the chief of medicine at City General when it happened." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "What these documents don't show is what happened after." Before he could continue, Robert interrupted, producing yet another document, this one even more shocking than the last. It was a recent photograph of Mrs. Thompson at her doctor's office, along with medical records suggesting she might not be in the right state of mind to make such significant business decisions. The room erupted in chaos. Board members began taking sides, some defending Mrs. Thompson's judgment, others expressing concern about the company's future. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, watching her dream opportunity seemingly slipping away. But as she looked at Mrs. Thompson, she saw something in the elderly woman's eyes that told her this battle was far from over. Mrs. Thompson rose from her chair once again, her voice cutting through the commotion like a knife through butter. "Since we're all sharing secrets," she said, reaching into her own briefcase, "perhaps it's time I shared one of my own." She pulled out a single piece of paper that made Robert's confident smile vanish instantly. The document she held would change everything, but not in the way anyone in that room expected. The document Mrs. Thompson held was a letter from Robert himself, dated just 3 months ago, attempting to secretly sell his voting shares in the company to a large corporate healthcare chain, the very type of organization Mrs. Thompson and her husband had spent their lives competing against. The company in question was known for shutting down charitable programs and prioritizing profits over patient care. "You see," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice steady and clear, "Robert here isn't concerned about my mental state or the company's future. He's worried because I refused his buyout offer, and now he's trying to prevent me from protecting this company's true mission." The board members sat in stunned silence as she continued. "The same corporate chain has been trying to acquire us for years. They sent me this evidence of Robert's dealings, hoping I would sell out of spite." Dr. Richards stood up again, adding his voice to Mrs. Thompson's. "And about that incident in Sarah's file, what these documents don't show is that her quick thinking and courage that day led to changes in our hospital's emergency protocols. Her actions ultimately saved not just one life, but many others through policy changes. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks, just like Mrs. Thompson and her husband did when they started this company." Robert, his face red with anger and embarrassment, tried to interject, but Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished. "The real test of leadership isn't just about making good business decisions," she said, looking around the room. "It's about maintaining your humanity while doing so. Sarah has demonstrated this time and time again, not just in that one incident, but every day in how she lives her life." Then came the final surprise. Mrs. Thompson revealed that the company had recently received an unprecedented grant to expand its charitable healthcare programs. A grant that had one specific condition: the new leadership must have direct healthcare experience and a proven track record of community service. "This grant," Mrs. Thompson smiled, "will double our capacity to help those in need, but we'll lose it if we don't have the right person in charge." The board members looked at each other, then at the documents spread across the table. One by one, they began to nod. The vote that followed was unanimous, except for Robert, who stormed out of the room, never to return to the company again. But there was one last twist that no one saw coming. As Sarah accepted the position, Mrs. Thompson revealed her own news. Her medical records hadn't been completely fabricated. She did have a diagnosis, but it wasn't dementia as Robert had implied. It was cancer, and she had only a few months left. She had been racing against time to ensure her company ended up in the right hands. Through tears, Sarah promised to honor Mrs. Thompson's legacy. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't done surprising everyone. "My last gift," she said softly, "isn't to you, Sarah. It's to your children." She explained that she had set up a special educational trust for Sarah's kids, ensuring they would never have to choose between their dreams and their financial security, the same choice Sarah had struggled with for years. The story of Sarah and Mrs. Thompson became legendary in their community, not just as a tale of kindness rewarded, but as proof that sometimes the most significant changes in our lives come from small moments of compassion. The company continued to thrive under Sarah's leadership, expanding its charitable programs while maintaining its commitment to putting people before profits. And every year, on the anniversary of that fateful day in the grocery store, Sarah would visit Mrs. Thompson's rose garden, which she had maintained exactly as it was, a living reminder that the simplest act of kindness can blossom into something extraordinary. 5 years later, Sarah stood in Mrs. Thompson's rose garden, now in full bloom with the spring flowers she had so lovingly tended. The company had flourished beyond anyone's expectations, becoming a model for ethical healthcare management across the country. The scholarship program, named in honor of Mrs. Thompson, had already helped hundreds of aspiring nurses achieve their dreams. Sarah's children, now teenagers, had grown into compassionate young people who understood the value of kindness and service. Her daughter had started a peer mentoring program at her high school, while her son volunteered at the very hospital where Sarah had once worked double shifts. The educational trust Mrs. Thompson established had indeed changed their lives, but more importantly, it had taught them the power of paying kindness forward. The board members who had once doubted Sarah's abilities had become her strongest supporters. Dr. Richards, still serving as a senior advisor, often remarked that the company's charitable programs had helped more people in the past 5 years than in the previous 20 combined. The grant money had been used to open 3 new community health centers in underserved neighborhoods, providing accessible health care to thousands who previously had none. Robert's attempted takeover had inadvertently led to stronger corporate governance policies, ensuring the company's charitable mission would be protected for generations to come. He had tried to challenge the board's decision in court, but withdrew when evidence of his backdoor dealings became public. Ironically, his actions had only served to strengthen the company's commitment to its original values. Mrs. Thompson had lived for 8 months after that pivotal board meeting, long enough to see Sarah successfully take the reins and begin implementing positive changes. In her final days, she had shared countless stories about her life with Sarah, passing on wisdom that went far beyond business management. Her last words to Sarah had been, "Remember, kindness is not just an action. It's a revolutionary act in a world that often forgets its importance." The company's annual report now included a kindness impact statement, measuring not just financial performance, but also the number of lives touched through their various programs. Other healthcare organizations had begun adopting similar metrics, creating a ripple effect that was slowly changing the industry's approach to community service. Sarah kept Mrs. Thompson's photograph in her office, next to the can of soup from that fateful day at the grocery store, a humble reminder of how life can change in an instant through simple acts of kindness. She had framed the shopping receipt too, dated and signed by the cashier who had witnessed their first interaction. Today, as Sarah walked through the garden, she noticed a young intern helping an elderly patient navigate the hospital's new walking path that wound through the roses. The intern didn't know Sarah was watching, but her gentle patience and genuine care brought tears to Sarah's eyes. It was exactly how Mrs. Thompson would have wanted her legacy to live on. As the sun set over the garden, casting long shadows across the blooming roses, Sarah reflected on how a single moment of kindness had transformed not just her life, but the lives of countless others. The company's motto, inspired by Mrs. Thompson's philosophy, now read, "Every act of kindness blooms into a garden of possibilities." And so, the story that began with a simple offer to help reach a can of soup had grown into something far more meaningful. A reminder that in a world often divided by differences, kindness remains the most powerful bridge between hearts, and the truest measure of success isn't found in profit margins, but in the lives we touch along the way.